I just first want to begin by thanking everyone who's watching right now, and a big thanks to Jay Sai Deepak for also joining me. I'm very new at this. Of course, a lot of you must have seen me on TV, but I'm trying this for the very first time just to look at issues at a greater length. So Jay Sai Deepak, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, is joining us. As our promotion may have told our viewers, I'm trying to look at certain issues surrounding speech, freedom of speech, and the laws that govern it. Speech is so crucial to us humans. It is truly what separates us from all other species on the planet. Speech as we say it, speech as we write it, how we use language to opine, to express ourselves, to write down and pen down our opinions, our thoughts. That's truly what being human is, isn't it, Sai? So it's very important in the light of recent events to look at just what is the world that we're living in terms of freedom of speech, because it's a term that is used so often. Freedom of speech is part of our lexicon today, and it divides people quite a bit. And we've seen some recent events like the Bangalore riots that were triggered because of certain Facebook posts, or what is going on even currently. And even right now, there are comments coming in on Prashant Bhushan's contempt case. And then something like what we've seen, a publisher deplatforming a book by canceling it just because a certain section of society did not want to see that book being published. So where are we really when it comes to freedom of speech? That's the main issue that we're discussing today. So Sai, I want to begin by discussing the issues that have cropped up with respect to the Bengaluru riots. They happened because certain comments were made on Facebook against certain religion. Allegation is that it was against two religions, and then there was a back and forth. But one particular comment really incited the wrath of that community, and we saw what happened. So the question that has emerged to it today is the issue of blasphemy, or laws that govern blasphemy. Should they exist in the first place? Give us a sense of the history of why blasphemy laws even exist, and what is their place in today's world.
So first of all, thanks Shivani for having this timely discussion, because I think it's an extremely relevant topic given the kind of episodes that we have seen over the past few weeks. Just a small correction. I'm not a senior advocate. I'm an advocate because there's a difference. But thanks. I hope one day I become one. So see, I think free speech, let's bust a few myths surrounding this particular issue. One, is there anything called as absolute free speech in any jurisdiction? Mm-hmm. Frankly speaking, there are very few jurisdictions where free speech gets a free pass on every subject. Mm. And in fact, even the most liberal regimes, when it comes to free speech, observe certain restraints. Okay, because at the end of the day, if speech is targeted at a certain audience and it is not just limited to a specific issue, and it is bound to affect another individual or let's say another community, most jurisdictions try and have some kind of fetters, or at least some kind of reasonable restrictions. The question is, to what extent can a restriction be justified? What is the fundamental basis for, let's say, the state's intervention when it comes to individual exercise of free speech? Okay, and most people are aware that as far as India is concerned, until the First Amendment to Article 19 of the Constitution, we did not have these restrictions that we see currently in the Constitution on free speech. These restrictions were introduced as part of the First Amendment to the Constitution that was brought into effect by Jawaharlal Nehru in consultation with Dr. Ambedkar, with massive criticism from several members of the government then, including Sri Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who effectively said that the very same gags and fetters that the British man imposed on exercise of free speech on Indians appears to be, they appear to have re-entered the Constitution. And now the Indian government has kind of justified its position with respect to these restrictions and has effectively stepped into the shoes of the white man of the British colonizer, was the position that Sri Shyama Prasad Mukherjee took at that point. Now, we recognize about 5 to 6 categories of restrictions on free speech as the law exists today after the First Amendment. Remember that while the First Amendment was challenged in the Supreme Court with respect to the land reform legislations that were brought about and with respect to the constitutional amendments made with respect to land reforms, Those amendments that were brought into the constitution with respect to restrictions on free speech were never challenged. They have not been challenged till date, meaning thereby that for all practical purposes, the Indian Republic has accepted, at least de facto, all restrictions that exist on free speech as they exist in the constitution as on date. Okay. And we recognize defamation as one possible area. We also recognize, let's say, any disturbance to public order. Okay.
Yes.
Now, the IPC specifically recognizes certain provisions which have a bearing on religion and religious sentiments. Okay. So the two prominent provisions that are always discussed in the context of religion are section 153A and 295A. Okay. So one speaks of promoting enmity between two communities, which is 153A, and the other is specifically directed at hurting the religious sentiments of a particular community. Okay. So in most instances, both these provisions are combinedly invoked. They are invoked together because typically in 9 out of 10 instances, the person who makes a comment with respect to the religious figure of another community happens to be from a different community altogether. And therefore, law enforcement agencies deem it fit to invoke both 295A, which is hurting of religious sentiments of the other community, and promotion of enmity as well. These two provisions put together largely form part of what we know as blasphemy law in India. We do not have a specific statute as far as blasphemy law is concerned across the country. These are the two provisions that we typically invoke. Now, the interesting part is this particular provision, which we know as the blasphemy law, was subjected to a constitutional challenge in the Supreme Court. In fact, it was challenged, saying that a blasphemy law such as this has no business being in the statute book because, one, per se, it constitutes an unreasonable restriction on free speech. Two, it's a slippery slope where a mere theological disagreement or criticism of another point of view could translate to hurting somebody's sentiments. And each time you actually open your mouth to express a certain comment, you run the risk of offending someone or the other. Okay. And therefore, somebody's hurt sentiments or fragile sentiments cannot form the basis of my exercise of free speech. When I am making a perfectly legitimate point from either a theological perspective or even from a rational perspective, I don't need to be a believer in a particular religion to criticize another religion's point of view, has been India's civilizational approach. Because you see, there has been a healthy tradition in Indian civilization and Indian sampradaya, so to speak, of criticizing each other's approach to divinity and whatnot. Okay, so that hasn't stopped anyone from necessarily, let's say, living by what they believe in. It has never led to violent reactions. It has never led to a situation where somebody decides to gag somebody else at the expense of the sword or at the expense of life or losing their life or limb. That has never happened. That is a relatively recent phenomenon in India's civilizational journey. But in modern independent, or let's say modern India's history, this particular aspect has a history of at least 150 to, let's say, 175 years, I would say. Largely what has happened, I think, this provision can be traced to a particular incident that took place in the northwest frontier province, which, of course, which continues to be part of Pakistan and as part of undivided India. So around that time, Swami Shraddhanand of Arya Samaj decided to undertake a certain activity of reconverting the Muslims of those parts of undivided India back to their original faith, which is Hinduism. And when this started, I think publications started from both sides or both communities where they started insulting each other's religions. So the community from which he was trying to attract people back into the Hindu fold decided to come out with a derogatory publication on Devi Sita. And in response, the Hindu community decided to come out with a publication on the religious figure or the head of that particular community. And that is what we know as the book, which is known as Rangila Rasool or whatever it is. Yes. Okay. And then this led to violent reactions from both ends. And I think a case was also instituted against the publisher of that particular book. And I think the publisher of that book was murdered in the campus of the court. He was assassinated as well. And this more or less forms the backdrop of the British government coming out with a legislation or let's say a law such as 295A for all practical purposes.
Did it exist before in Western?
So in the sense, before independent India, before the Republic, the law as we know today with respect to blasphemy had already taken shape. Okay. So what we have continued is a colonial instrument, so to speak, for all practical purposes in terms of that particular legislation. But that provision has been tested on the annals of Indian Constitution by a 5-judge bench, okay, by a constitution bench in Ramji Bhai judgment. And there the court has effectively said that when there is a clear intent to hurt somebody's sentiments and where there is a deliberate and malicious intent, so therefore it can't be inadvertent and it can't be something which lacks malice. So you require the twin requirements of deliberate as well as malicious intent to go after somebody's religious sentiments. And when you make such a statement, that is typically the situation where 295A is supposed to be invoked. Okay, but what the Supreme Court says and what the beat constable or what the station house officer of a police station does is very, very different. So 9 out of 10 instances, this particular provision is invoked at the drop of a hat. And the moment, let's say, a complaint of this nature is registered or an FIR is registered, you endanger the life of the person who has been named as the accused in that particular case, because then you brand him as a, let's say, a phobe of a particular religion, and then a bounty is put on its head and so on and so forth. Okay. So 2 things emerge from this. One.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you very quickly. Before we get laws should exist, you mentioned that this was challenged.
Yes. Yes.
So the courts have that's
upheld the validity of it.
It has upheld it.
Ramji Lal Modi was the state of Uttar Pradesh. This is a judgment of 1957. Okay. And the judgment itself makes for an interesting read because this was again in the context of what we know today as Gauraksha. Okay. And this was this particular provision was invoked against the publisher of a magazine from Uttar Pradesh by the name Gaurakshak itself. Okay. Where he had taken a certain position with respect to why the ban on cow slaughter must be implemented with greater vigor, so on and so forth. And he took a position against illegal slaughterhouses prevalent at that particular point of time and which are largely in the hands of a particular community. Okay, so this is the backdrop, and this judgment itself makes it a fantastic.
This was seen under the blasphemy law lens?
Yeah, of course. The entire thing was about the blasphemy law.
But how is this blasphemous?
So if he takes a position with respect to Gauraksha, saying that perhaps there is a religious sentiment that drives the slaughter of cows when there is no scriptural sanction in any community's requirements, okay, then what is the purpose of actually slaughtering cows other than to offend or insult the memory of Hindus and or to, let's say, offend their religious sentiments? Okay. So his article seemed to have questioned the intention behind the wanton slaughter of cows. Okay. Mm-hmm. Assume for a moment that there is a particular animal which is sacred to one particular community, and that particular animal does not find any mention in the scripture of another community given the geography it comes from. Okay. So where is the need for the sanction for slaughter of cows other than perhaps let's say to cause outrage or whatever may be? That was his position. That was more or less the lines on which the article was written. And therefore, since his article delved into intentions or scriptural intentions or basis of a certain practice, the provision of 295A was invoked against him. He was in
but
fact...
there is no malice, as you said. There is no malice in exactly. This. It's only a critique, and a fair critique perhaps.
The funny part is, assume for a moment that we decide to discuss something more controversial or more contentious, which is, if I have to discuss the destruction of the original temple that existed at Ram Janmabhoomi in the 16th century, perhaps in 1528, by a Mughal general, Mir Baqi, and I have to ask, was this an isolated instance? Or if there are 40,000 such similar instances across the country, and if I have to connect the dot and ask what is the common pattern that emerges, was all of this done purely for political purposes, or is there something else that drives this particular mentality? As a historian or as an academic or even as a lawyer, you will need to connect the dots and you will need to explore the basis of these actions. And it is inevitable that in the context of a religious place of worship, you enter the realm of religion, you enter the realm of scripture. Okay. The moment you do so, and you end up taking certain uncomfortable positions which are unpalatable or politically incorrect, that doesn't rise to the level of blasphemy. Okay. Statement of truth or a statement of factual positions cannot be an argument which is rooted or which is founded in blasphemy. Okay. Most importantly, if I am the non-practitioner of a certain faith, okay, I can't be accused of blasphemy at the end of the day because I don't believe in your religious sentiments. I only have the obligation to respect your right to believe in what you think is sacred. But beyond that, if you're asking me to suppress my rational faculties and to not apply my sense of discrimination and my sense of questioning or inquiry when it comes to a certain practice, then what is the point of us living in the same society? When we
Yes.
live in the same society as part of the same country, we are bound to question, analyze, dissect, and let's say dig deeper as far as each other's practices are concerned. We are human beings at the end of the day. Now, if blasphemy laws are going to be invoked to the extent of suppressing somebody's genuine inquiry, assume that I write an academic book and I populate it with scripture. I basically say there seems to be some basis for this in some scripture. There seems to be some correlation between an act and a thought and a certain religious sanction. Okay, this cannot immediately translate to the degree of blasphemy.
But it has been, according
In some instances, it has been, and in fact, the Supreme Court's interpretation, frankly speaking, has not been particularly great. But the Calcutta High Court's judgment in another case was much more mature, and the court clearly said, unless and until these twin requirements are satisfied, if you choose to adopt or let's say invoke this particular provision in a trigger-happy fashion, you're bound to impose unreasonable restrictions on free speech than the Constitution ever envisaged in the first place. And you may end up exposing this particular provision to a challenge on the grounds of constitutionality. Okay. The only thing that saves this particular provision from being struck down is if these safeguards are maintained and observed both in letter as well as in spirit each time you invoke it. Okay. So my traditional approach to this particular subject has been that perhaps a preliminary investigation of sorts must be undertaken by the police before an FIR is registered under Section 295A to ask whether this is truly a case where something of, let's say, something in the nature of blasphemy is made out. Is there a political score that is being settled? Is there a religious score that is being settled? Is there an individual score that is being settled? In which case, why invoke such a sensitive provision? Because you see, a provision such as this is not limited only at an individual. Two communities immediately come into play. Okay. And the chances of the situation spiraling out of control and translating to a huge law and order situation is fairly high. Therefore, certain sections of the IPC, particularly those with respect to religion, must be invoked with a lot of care, must be invoked with a lot of caution and with a lot of circumspection.
So you're saying there's no need to strike them down completely, because the argument that has been made, Sai, also is that they are applied very selectively in the first place. Not everybody can go and register a complaint. They have to just tolerate certain insults to their religion on a daily basis. Since the state guarantee that all such cases can be met with in the same way, it inherently leads to an inequality in the way that this section is used and applied. On top of that is my question. Can the state even govern what people are thinking, saying? Should state machinery be involved in doing so when we have to stop so many other crimes that are affecting people's lives?
Right.
This is something that the state can waste its hours on and its manpower on.
See, let us be clear that the state is not going to police thought, and no provision can police thought. Assume for a moment that in the deepest recesses of your mind and heart, you have a lot of hatred for a particular community, or you have a lot of bile or prejudice for a particular individual or a particular class of people. Okay. There is nothing that the state can do about it. Okay. Society can perhaps try and address that particular situation, or families can try and address that particular situation at a very individual level. But from a state standpoint or from a legal standpoint, the law comes into force and the law becomes relevant only when it translates to express words or action. Okay. Until thought takes the form of speech, thought takes the form of expression, or thought takes the form of conduct or acts or deeds, the law has no place at all. Okay.
But why should it even try to control the speech? I could say it in my drawing room, nothing could happen to me. Correct. I could write a post, maybe it doesn't trigger any outrage and I get away with it. Some other post triggers an outrage, and we saw what happened in Bengaluru. Correct. So the question is also about the inequality with which this law or any such law can be applied. Right. On top of that, as a mature country, should we deal with statements that offend any kind of sentiments of ours, religious or otherwise, right, or just try to clamp down on them?
So there are multiple layers that you have touched upon. Let me try and address it in different ways. So let's first address the question of when a provision is fundamentally capable of being applied selectively or with a lot of convenience and is capable of being applied with mischief. is it better not, or is it not better to just do away with the provision? Okay. Now let's ask and see if the same logic would apply to provisions that relate to dowry, provisions that relate to sexual harassment, provisions that relate to outraging of modesty, provisions that are meant to protect women's rights and dignity and safety. Okay. There is enough literature to say that, or even provisions that relate to caste-related atrocities. Okay. That's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court decided to come out with certain safeguards on the SC/ST Act. Okay. The presence of mischief or the possibility of mischief itself is no reason to strike down a particular provision, because the moment you think of a knife which is capable of dicing vegetables, you also open up the possibility of murdering people with that knife. Okay. The test is very, very simple when it comes to a provision under the Constitution. Does the provision in itself permit selective application and convenient application? If the answer is a no, the problem is not with the provision. The problem is with the authority's mindset when it comes to invoking the provision selectively. Okay. Then it becomes a question of, to put it crudely, jiski haath mein lathi hai. That's how it works, right? That's how it works, right? So therefore, this is not a legal question. This is more of how do we ensure that the state approaches and invokes these provisions with a bit more of reasonableness and with a bit more of fairness. Okay.
The problem also happens, Sai, is that when a legal provision like this exists, then the expectation becomes that it will be acted upon.
Right.
Reason why I came about why I even have something like this, because if a section like this exists, then sections can say that no, it exists, therefore it is my right to clamp down on this. The moment you do away with the section,
right,
open a door where you have to deal with it tomorrow. If you come across it, you have to deal with it in a different way. Of course, law and order has to be maintained.
So that's where the second strand of your question comes about. And the question is this, and there is a decent chance that what I say may offend certain sentiments, so be it. The basic point is, assuming that the civilizational impulse has been that somebody respects the Veda and somebody doesn't respect the Veda as the sole authority, and both such schools of thought have comfortably coexisted with harmony in this particular country. So Buddhism, Jainism, Vedic Brahmanism, and other forms of Hindu schools of thought have comfortably existed. It clearly shows that dharmic schools of thought and dharmic faith systems are fundamentally comfortable with the concept of dissent, are fundamentally comfortable with the concept of apostasy. We don't have a concept of apostasy. We are comfortable with atheism. You don't want to believe, it's up to you. Whatever you choose to do is up to you. However, if there are faith systems which recognize the concept of blasphemy, which recognize the concept of apostasy, and which expect respect not just from adherents of their own faith, but also from others, okay, then you have to ask yourself two things. Should we not effectively expect them to conform to this civilization's code of conduct? Which is to say, you believe in your faith, no problem. But the moment your faith runs into a certain conflict with civilizational values on free speech and expression, then what must prevail? That must be the basic question. If other faith systems are capable of withstanding hurt, are capable of withstanding criticism, and we don't even ask the question whether the criticism is valid, fair, genuine, or with malice. We don't ask any of those questions. You have a point of view. If it's malicious, then the consequences are for you to bear. There is nothing that we can do about it. And if it is malicious, then we have no reason to even take you into account. We don't need to consider what you say. I will simply ignore that point of view because it doesn't come from a place of genuineness. Okay. If that is the philosophy that this particular land has followed, and those faith systems that don't emanate from this particular civilization and don't come from this particular land are having trouble wrapping that particular concept around their heads, the state must ask itself, should we not encourage them to be a bit more open about criticism? Okay. Or
even if it's the vilest of criticism,
exactly,
even if it's malicious to begin with,
correct,
but such elements will always exist in society.
Let's remember this, that some people believe, although it's not entirely true, that Manusmriti is scripture, but Dr. Ambedkar burnt Manusmriti and tore the Manusmriti in public in front of a group of Brahmins, in front of a group of Hindus and practicing Hindus as part of his movement. His actions did not incite violence, by the way. Okay. And today he is hailed as one of the, let's say, greatest social reformers that India has produced and whatnot. He's given a certain pedestal, he's exalted, and everything has happened. Okay. So this is a civilization that respects these points of view, and at the end of the day says, there is a decent chance that I may not agree with Dr. Ambedkar's position on certain issues, but that's no reason to get violent at all. Okay, that's no reason to get violent with him or his followers. As simple as that. Unfortunately, I don't think other faith systems or other, let's say, groups, so to speak, have still managed to reconcile themselves with these civilizational values. So the state must ask itself, should we take upon themselves the responsibility of saying, sorry, we are not here to protect every hurt sentiment and every fragile sentiment. Our resources are better equipped and better used for other activities where there's a real problem. If there is a if you believe that your religion is so weak and so fragile, or your belief is so weak and so fragile, then the problem lies in your head, and perhaps that's not even a problem in your religion. However, here is where there is a tricky issue. If they consciously believe that one of their religious duties is to stop others from criticizing them, because there is a scriptural sanction to prevent somebody from criticizing their religion, you are asking them to give up a faith system, or let's say you're asking them to give up a cardinal pillar of their faith. That is, one aspect of your religious duty must effectively give way to civilizational, let's say, duties or civilizational moorings and civilizational way of life when it comes to criticism. Okay, that requires a state which has the guts to actually deal with these issues. Traditionally, India has been a soft state with absolutely no spine. It lies supine in the face of resistance. And the moment a couple of stones are pelted at the Indian state buckles, particularly in matters of religion. That is the harsh and the hard reality of the Indian state. Okay, and here perhaps I think Lee Kuan Yew's position with respect to religious freedom is brilliant, where he says, a soft state which tries to please everyone will end up festering and fomenting more mischief in the society than actually addressing the issue. Yes. If you think that keeping your mouth shut and turning a deaf ear and a blind eye to a situation will result in peace, no, you will actually increase belligerence, you'll increase bellicose behavior in the name of religion. You choose your priorities, which is to say, do you want me to constantly, let's say, attend to your hurt religious sentiments, or do you want me to protect your property? Do you want me to protect your dignity? You ask these basic questions. On that, I don't think any Indian government in the last 73 years has had the guts to take up this particular question. They continue to say we respect all religions, we continue to respect all of this. You can continue to respect all religions without sacrificing on your civilizational values. That is a balance that I think the Indian state, regardless of the dispensation power, has ever been able to strike.
Moving on from religious sentiments, what about laws that may also be applied to other sentiments? Specifically, for example, caste sentiments, or even, let's say, gender issues.
Right.
Do we really need them? Can we get ahead if everybody is going to be always mired? Oh, he said this, she said this hurt my sentiment. Can we coddle babies all the time?
See, defamation is recognized for a different reason.
Yes.
Because it's not just a question of hurting a sentiment, but it translates to pulling down somebody's reputation in the eyes of his peers.
Yeah, no, so I'm not talking about defamation.
But defamation certainly exists.
That is anything you say which is libelous, which brings down the dignity of another person, especially when that person is living in, for example, and hinders in them leading their life, is a separate issue.
Right.
Barring defamation and speech that incites violence.
Right.
There is also a term called hate speech.
Right.
I mean, how are you going to define hate speech?
So
again, not just religiously, but otherwise as well.
So let's address the caste-related angle as well as the gender-related angle before we go to the question of hate speech. See, as far as caste is concerned, the fact is that unfortunately there has been a phase in Indian history where certain caste names and certain professions have been used in a derogatory fashion.
Yes.
Okay? Now, that is not hurting. So that's not the same as hurting somebody's religious sentiments by criticizing a certain theological aspect. That's very different. Let's be very clear. Okay. So if your religious sentiment is hurted because I express my disagreement perhaps in harsh terms with respect to another religious figure, that's not the same as using either a religious name or a caste name in a derogatory fashion as a slur. Okay. So there I will not strike a distinction between religion and caste. Assume for a moment that a religious identity or a caste identity is heard as a cuss word. Okay. There is a very clear threshold that has been crossed. Okay. And that particular threshold is crossed because it has the effect of dehumanizing an entire cross section of people. Okay. And you open them to normalized forms of violence, both physical and verbal. Okay. Therefore, that is one threshold that even I am willing to recognize, to basically say, when you dehumanize a community, not a thought process, by the way, okay, strike a distinction between a thought and an idea and a people or a community. As long as your problem in principle is with respect to a thought and you believe that a certain way of life is something that you don't find agreeable, that's a different thing from basically saying all those people who follow this particular way of life do not merit to be treated as human beings or should not be treated equally. That is where a line is completely crossed. That in most jurisdictions, at least from whatever jurisdictions that we seem to be drawing our, let's say, inspiration from, that is the litmus test and that is the Lakshman Rekha for hate speech. Okay. It dehumanizes and most importantly, it incites others into taking action, which is an act of violence, an act of social segregation, an act of social distancing of a particular kind, where you basically say, let's cut off relations altogether.
So you're saying that discrimination, not just in action, but in words, if it promotes discrimination, can also be acted upon. The speech of discrimination can be acted upon.
Exactly. So if I have to choose between two provisions, 295A and 153A, 295A has lesser justification than 153A. So if you promote enmity between two communities, then you present a real law and order problem. And therefore, there's a real issue for the state to look at. Okay, that is one of the central objects of a state. The state's object is not to protect religious sentiments, but the state's goal can certainly be to prevent any violence that happens in the name of religion because of promotion of enmity between two communities. So therefore, constitutionally speaking, or let's say morally speaking, and philosophically speaking, there is more justification for preserving the constitutionality of 153A as opposed to 295A would be the principal position that I think is possible to take.
Any change that is possible legally, you think, before we move on to all of these sections?
No, I don't think so, because it's too much of a hot potato for any government to touch. Notwithstanding the numbers, if the government ultimately feels, "Arey bhai, isko beech hone ki kya zarurat hai?" Okay, why do we unnecessarily get into this? Unless there is a political incentive to actually touch upon this issue and take it up, I don't see any government in the foreseeable future to do so, because one, the society itself is not ready for it. So there is no significant constituency or cross-section of the people, the voting people, which has taken this particular position, because religion matters to us so much today, and rightly so. I'm not ever going to deny the importance of religion. India is a country of religion. The state may be a secular state, but the society is not a secular society. It is a religious society. It is not a negative statement at all. That has been the lifeblood of this country. Okay, there's no doubting it at all. And when they see that a certain sentiment is being pampered in the name of 295A, or that it is increasingly applied in such a convenient sense, the reaction is going to be that if I am not yielded any quarter and this is the treatment I am going to be subject to, why should I let go of any legal option that is available for me to harass the other person or to protect my sentiments? I was willing to say that my sentiments don't necessarily matter. I will continue to believe regardless of what you say. But if you're willing to use constitutional means, legal means, as well as illegal means to come after me for a sentiment that I legitimately express, then now there are no bets. All gates have been opened. All bets are off. It's a no holds barred fight. Then I will continue to do everything at my disposal, legally and otherwise. That's been the reaction.
So basically what we have to look forward to is a slew of litigation and individual cases. As in the near future, this is the only way to go about it, where individuals have to take up these causes and say, oh, you are not letting me speak, I will not let you speak. Unfortunately, that is obviously not an ideal society, but we are far from ideal right now.
In fact, here I think a good empirical study would throw a lot of light on how this has been invoked. I am going to ask myself this basic blunt question. Under a non-BJP dispensation, when sentiments are hurt, whose sentiments are hurt, and who is the subject of a 295 complaint, and which community or which members of which community are frequently targeted in the name of blasphemy, and under a BJP dispensation, who is hurt and what happens. And my sense basically tells me that in 9 out of 10 instances, every time members, or let's say icons of, let's say the majority community are hurt, they are barely ever the subject of a blasphemy law. And the number of instances where the blasphemy law invoked is perhaps more during the BJP dispensation. And typically, it is with respect to icons who don't belong to the majority community. Okay. So the political mischief, the politicization of a legal provision, and the politicization and weaponization of a religious sentiment, I'm clearly saying, happens under a particular dispensation because the idea is to create a certain atmosphere during a certain dispensation. That is my takeaway. I have severe criticisms of every party, but even I can't effectively turn a blind eye to the fact that there is intense selectivism, intense convenience, and intense mischief in the manner in which these provisions are invoked to basically say, no, 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 the idea is to effectively protect the community, which is always in the nature of a victim. Okay. So 295A is constantly used to create a victimhood narrative surrounding a particular community. And not all minorities, some minorities are more equal than other minorities. That has been the history of Indian secularism. So those provisions are typically invoked to protect certain minority sentiments. I don't think that helps the cause of that community, nor does it help the cause of community cohesion. It only divides, or let's say it leads to deeper fault lines. And whether it translates to litigation or not, I think is the secondary concern. The primary concern is that you're looking at a fundamentally divided society.
Yeah. Unfortunately, like there is sexism, and to counter it, sometimes there is reverse sexism. Similarly, if these sections are being applied in an unequal manner, or you're saying that victimhood is being used, then sometimes the other community can also fall into the trap of becoming victims. But I would say that that would be the wrong way to go. If a community does not feel victimized or has the capacity to let go of certain even malicious criticism or attacks, then it should continue to do so, because falling into the trap of becoming victims or using that to drive litigation or to drive a point perhaps is not going to be successful. That is my personal opinion, and it kind of changes the societal norm that you have also talked about, the cultural norm, where we just accept criticism for what it is, ignore it, and learn to get on with our lives. I do want to move forward those now, Sai. And the other issue I want to discuss today is contempt. And we see currently contempt proceedings, ongoing in some manner or the other, as far as Prashant Bhushan is concerned. He has obviously stuck to his guns, saying that judges need to learn to take criticism. He has quoted apparently judges in Ireland saying that even if it is malicious, even if it is wrong, even if it is absolutely stupid, judges must learn to take that criticism. But obviously we know that there is a distinction between criticizing a judgment and bringing the entire judiciary into disrepute with certain allegations that you cannot prove. So what is our stance on it? Should there be contempt proceedings for criticizing judges and judiciary at large?
See, the question that I would ask myself from a long-term perspective is 98 to 2004, 2014 to 2020. So you're looking at 6 years plus about 6 years, 12 years. Why is it that nobody else has deemed it fit to do away with the contempt provisions in the rest of the period, right? If there are two dispensations, one of which has been in power for less than 15 years and the other has been in power for the better part of India's independent history or independent India's history, where is the question of suddenly saying that these provisions shouldn't have existed? So there are two provisions which are very conveniently invoked: sedition and contempt. And every time sedition or contempt is invoked under a BJP dispensation, the question that is asked is, this is a colonial law. Why do we continue to stick to it? Then why didn't you do away with it before? What were you doing all these days? If it continues to be in the statute book, and today you see that you're at the receiving end of this particular provision, you suddenly harken back to the fact and you basically say this is something that the white man would have done. Why do we continue to do this? Are we brown sahibs who have effectively stepped into the shoes of the white man? That seems to be the allegation. It reeks and smacks of, I'm sorry to say, hypocrisy. Okay. There are two positions to this. One is on the basis of realism, saying how convenient our positions can be, and two, at an idealistic level, whether the Contempt of Courts Act should exist in the first place at all, and what must be its means and bounds. So any number of judges from other jurisdictions will tell you that the higher you go, the more open you must be to criticism. Okay. And it is, see, at the end of the day, in a democracy, no arm of the state or no organ of the state can be exempt from or immune from any form of criticism. Okay.
Yes.
And I'm perfectly comfortable with institutional criticism where you believe that the judiciary is perhaps not doing as much as it must to, let's say, push back against the executive. That's an ongoing debate which will go on for eternity till the cows come home. However, when you make very personalized comments, and these are very specific comments which effectively address an individual's conduct in a certain position, okay, an individual's conduct outside that particular position is not the subject of contempt. What he or she does holding that particular position, if it is effectively a scurrilous comment, okay, I am effectively going to treat the existence of a contempt provision at par with an institutional defamatory provision, okay, because it is no more just about me as an individual. You have attacked me in this particular position without any basis, and when you do so, the very hope that people come to this particular institution in the hope of justice and put their faith in it, okay, is shaken to a significant extent. Be that as it may, I think it's time for us to revisit this entire thing, okay, because Contempt of Courts Act was largely introduced to prevent the criticism of British judges when they decided to go after Indian freedom fighters or political prisoners or whatever it may be. Whether it should be done away with in entirety, if so, what is its impact with respect to, let's say, confidence in the judiciary is a larger debate that we must have. But I must certainly ask myself this basic question. Someone who has been in the profession, who knows the rules of the profession, chooses to make a very specific comment with respect to people in a certain capacity. And I would say if you believe that you're right, then you should back it up with something, okay? A spit and scoot approach perhaps may not do justice. And let me be very clear. A similar approach with respect to constitutional positions such as the vice president and the president too is problematic. You get it? So governors, presidents, vice presidents, and judges, especially judges of constitutional courts, are treated at a certain level for a very specific reason, because these are offices of dignity and they are meant to protect and they're meant to symbolize something, okay? I'm not saying don't criticize. That is never going to be my position. Judgments can be criticized. Statements made in public can be criticized. Statements made in press conferences can be criticized. Articles can be criticized. Their positions can be criticized. But when you're leveling an allegation which affects their integrity, okay, there is a degree of responsibility that is expected, okay? I'm not saying if there is something that you're aware of, don't talk about it at all. But if you truly believe that you have something, then at least make it a point to support that particular statement so that people know that there is more to this than meets the eye, if at all there is something of that sort. But if that's not the case, when you effectively make a scurrilous allegation or let's say an allegation which you have not backed up yet, I can't even call it a baseless allegation because I don't know what you have or you don't have. You have worsened your position by not placing anything before any forum to support your position. I'm not talking of a particular individual. I'm saying basically this is how it has to be treated. Therefore, my position on issues of this nature would be, one, there is a larger debate that I think is warranted in terms of Contempt of Courts Act. Two, perhaps the judiciary may want to look at, let's say, the manner in which it appoints people through the collegium system. Because you see, when you believe that nobody else can effectively have a role to play in your appointments, and you are the final word when it comes to appointments at that highest level, okay, then the impression, or let's say the perception that is formed in the people's mind is you are not answerable to anyone in any manner. There is no degree of accountability at any level, particularly when it comes
to that you are clamping down on people who may speak against you.
Exactly. So therefore, then they connect these two and they ask themselves, not only are you immune from any kind of scrutiny when it comes to appointments, you're also immune from any kind of criticism. However, that would be a broad assumption. The criticism in this particular case is not an institutional criticism. The criticism that has been made in this particular instance is a personal criticism of a specific nature directed at individuals holding a certain office. That crosses a certain level of seriousness. So that can't be conflated with other forms of criticism.
You're basically saying just like an individual in our country, a citizen is protected against defamation. Similarly, even though they are in high public offices, judges also have the right to protect their personal integrity against, what is essentially defamatory.
Correct.
When an allegation, it is just defamatory. Does it not qualify under the definition of opinion? Can opinion be made like this, or will it be considered defamatory?
See, an opinion which alludes to a certain fact is a mixture of opinion and factual allegation. Okay. Second, again, look at what is it that people are going to ask. Are you really telling me that even if you believe that your opinion is true, things have suddenly changed only since 2014? Doesn't it reek of, let's say, political selectivism here? That all your criticisms against every arm of the state and every constitutional position and every dignitary suddenly seems to trace its origins from only May 2014. So T0 is May 2014. Why don't you extend the scope of this particular discussion and let's see how far back in time it goes? You've been in the profession for at least 30 to 35 years. Are you in a position to make similar statements with respect to all the people who've held this position for the 35 years of your service in this profession? If the answer is a no, clearly there is something else at play here, is the normal conclusion that a reasonable person is bound to come to. So I'm making the statement which is qualified. One, you have to ensure that institutions are receptive to criticism. But when you're asking individuals of the institutions to be receptive to criticism or allegations, criticism is very different from allegation. And when you're making an allegation in that particular post, you're not just making a personal allegation, it affects the manner in which that institution is perceived by the people. At the barest possible level, in the most fundamental form that a contempt action exists, this is what the contempt law is meant to preserve: institutional integrity. You want to say something which is of serious nature and of serious import, then please do so with responsibility and with support. Then perhaps you're better off. But otherwise, I don't think it effectively merits any kind of discussion.
I don't think that there is any way, Sai, that I can justify the antecedents of the person in question here, Prashant Bhushan.
Right.
Everybody knows the place that he comes from. Everybody has seen his litigation attempts and also his public statements. In fact, he was also lampooned quite a bit because he had upheld or celebrated contempt against another individual in the past. So obviously there is hypocrisy writ large at what he does. But of course, I wanted to use this instance for a larger debate on, whether the general public also has begun to feel that, like you said, one, there is no accountability of the judiciary, and secondly, they don't even like it when they hear something against them. But by and large, what has been witnessed is that judgments have been criticized. They were done after the Ram Temple as well. They have been done even before that and will be done after that, which is obviously a democratic right. But just like you have the protection of our defamation law against anyone coming and, spitting and scooting, similarly, the judge should also, as an individual and also as the office bearer, have that protection, right?
Just consider one more thing. Okay. You're a journalist and you know the number of articles that are written in veiled fashion against judges, not just against judgments, by the way.
Yes.
Okay. If a particular outcome doesn't come on expected lines in accordance with a certain school of thought, then automatically tweets, articles, conferences, seminars, workshops, books are written on how the judiciary is suddenly compromised. Okay. And this discussion picks up steam under a particular regime. That's a fact. Okay. Second, after the Ram Janmabhoomi case, I don't think any of the Supreme Court of any other country would have put up with the kind of direct allegations which were made on the nature of the outcome, on the intention of the outcome. And with a constitution bench, which is comprised of people with very different thought processes. Okay. Not all human beings necessarily adhere to the same school of thought, even if they come from the same institution or belong to the same institution. So you have a rainbow bench, so to speak, that represents a variety of hues, a variety of, let's say, ideologies, and they're entitled to their ideologies, so to speak. And they arrive at a unanimous decision based on archaeology and whatnot. And then the losing party puts out a statement through a tweet, effectively saying that this particular outcome is political in nature, and therefore judgments won't decide it, history will decide it, and politics is never temporary, and we will address this particular issue at a later stage. What kind of a threat are you issuing to the rest of the society? What kind of allegations are you making with respect to a particular institution? Please remember that not a day goes by when there is not a single headline in a major newspaper that deals with the Supreme Court. Okay. So let us also be cognizant of the fact, and I say this without any kind of, let's say, I don't need to be abashed about this. I am a practitioner before this particular forum. Therefore, I can confidently say that this forum is always under intense scrutiny. They're always in catch-22. No matter what they do, they are always bound to be lampooned and criticized by everyone under the sun. Therefore, if somebody believes that the judiciary is not criticized, or it is too pricky to criticism, or it is too sensitive to criticism, the data shows otherwise. The number of articles which effectively attack and take pot shots at the judiciary or even members of the judiciary, compare that with the number of contempt actions which are actually initiated. If data is all that guides us, what kind of data do we have to show that at the drop of a hat we immediately invoke contempt action? This is very different from saying whether that particular provision must exist in the statute book at all. I am not compromising that position on in terms of principle. I'm merely saying, look at the empirical evidence. You're talking of one case which has been discussed in the recent past. How many such cases have we discussed in let's say, in the last 6 years or 7 years or a decade, right? So when a certain threshold is crossed and it acquires a very serious character, even then, if the institution does not respond, the immediate conclusion is going to be, दाल में कुछ काला है, इसीलिए किसी ने कुछ बोला नहीं. Okay. Then is the institution not under any obligation to protect itself? People get away with these kind of statements. You criticize a certain outcome saying that you have not considered evidence. So for instance, when the Sabrimala judgment came out, the first judgment came out, I was certainly not happy with it. I have effectively expressed my displeasure at the particular judgment, and I have said that perhaps the lens through which this particular practice has been viewed is not an Indian lens. All these statements are statements made with respect to the merits of an issue. But the moment you go after an individual and you are associating that individual's conduct with a certain office, you have conflated the person with that particular office. Therefore, the person has the right to respond as much as he has a duty to respond on behalf of the office that he occupies. Right. Okay.
So for example, the criticism after Ram Janmabhoomi verdict was not so much on the merits of the case, was not so much on the articles, on the law applied, was not so much on the evidences. It was just opinion, which was put forward that, it's not right because I don't feel that it is right. So obviously that kind of criticism cannot legally be accepted. But I do want to ask you one more thing. People who obviously, like we discussed, speech laws as well, who say things against judges, etc., etc. But does it also matter that Prashant Bhushan is a lawyer himself? Does it also matter the position that the person enjoys in society, and therefore the responsibility that comes with it?
See, it's not a position that a person enjoys in a certain society. It is how better informed are you of the red lines with respect to a certain conversation. Okay. Assume for a moment that a lay person with absolutely no understanding of the nuances of how the legal profession works or how the judicial system works makes a statement. You can even dismiss that as the angst of a person who doesn't understand enough. And in several jurisdictions, in fact, there's a beautiful South African judgment of the Constitutional Court of South Africa which says, sometimes people use speech as a vent, okay, to let off steam. Okay. In a democracy, the beauty is that as opposed to picking up the sword and doing something stupid, you simply let off steam using your tongue and you exercise the right of free speech to criticize and be done with it. Okay. Then the state's duty is not to constantly react, but to say, theek hai. You have to say, you've had your say and I will listen to it, job done. Okay. I don't need to respond to it. And if I believe that there is really nothing meritorious in your particular position, that's it. You exercise your free speech and I exercise my duty to listen. That's the end of the matter. Okay. So I am of the very clear view that as far as some of these issues are concerned, it's perfectly okay to take the position that chalta hai chhod do doesn't make a difference at all. So to come back to your question, the problem must always be looked at from the standpoint of the person who is making that statement. Does he really know the consequences and the implications of making that particular statement? Let me be very clear. Mr. Modi attended the Bhumi Pujan. Okay. If Mr. Modi had not attended it in the position of a prime minister, and he had simply attended it as a normal person, as a practicing Hindu, the controversy perhaps wouldn't have been to this particular extent. Okay. So those who believe that his position as the prime minister has a certain connotation and therefore has a certain responsibility when it comes to a sensitive issue as Bhumi Pujan, are saying that somebody's position as a lawyer makes no difference to his right to exercise his free speech and expression. I'm sorry. The person who makes that particular statement is as important as the content of that particular statement. Because the question is, how much do you know? What has been your practical conduct? How have you treated such instances in the past? If you truly believe that a contempt action should not exist and you seem to be a public interest litigator, why have you not filed any petition challenging the existence of the Contempt of Courts Act till date? Why have you not initiated litigation against this on a constitutional ground? How many instances have you actually participated in where people who come from a different political background are the subject of contempt proceedings and you've jumped in to basically defend his right to express his particular opinion, even if you don't agree with his particular opinion? Now, when you don't do any of this, people are going to say, you can't have it both ways, yeah. Okay. You can't have the cake and eat it too. You can't speak from both sides of your mouth. And today, in the day of age and internet, when there is something called as internet karma, a Google search will immediately show, "Bhai, आपने क्या किया है past में, आप बात क्या कर रहे हैं, किसके बारे में कर रहे हैं, कुछ तो सोच लो." Public memory may be short, but internet memory is not at all short. Okay. In the next 500 years, we'll see everything come out. Okay.
Including this video and your thoughts.
Right. So, therefore, let's see, in a discussion such as this, some people are even bound to say, oh, he's perhaps acting as the mouthpiece of a certain government or whatever it may be. I am clearly saying my positions, you are welcome to criticize them. I don't have a problem. But at the very least, kindly don't be found talking from both sides of your mouth in two different time phases. Okay. What was your conduct before and what's your conduct later?
Yeah, it is a disease, being selective and being convenient. Unfortunately, most of us fall for it because, as I said, it is convenient. But as you rightly said that, today there is greater accountability post on all of us, including myself and yourself. We are all judged on what we have said in the past and what we have done in the past as well. All right, moving to the final portion of this chat, Sai. The latest episode which has happened, and it brings us back to the larger issue of speech and what can be done to protect it. Earlier, we talked about what can be done to do away with needless regulation, maybe needless articles and, laws that are not required. But now we step into a zone where what to do when somebody's actual right of speech is being trampled upon, and can the state interfere, even if it's a private individual or business? So our viewers must have known, and of course you are aware of how a book on Delhi riots has been deplatformed or cancelled as part of today's cancel culture, just because a certain section opposed to it. And actually the opposition was to a pre-launch event. But what has shockingly happened is that publisher has cancelled the book altogether, which is shocking because you chose to publish it and you knew what was in it, but suddenly you are cancelling the book altogether just because a few individuals that, others have a problem with were associated with a pre-launch event. So it is as shocking and quite blatant as it gets. Where do you stand on this? Because this is one more blatant incident which may not fall into the realm of litigation, but really does affect our lives.
So you see, I don't think people can tie themselves in more knots and push themselves in a corner, because while they seem to defend the right of a person to level allegations without basis at the highest court of the land, and they believe that all of this qualifies as free speech and expression and unfettered free speech and expression, and they're all for absolutism when it comes to free speech, again seem to be lobbying to somehow prevent the publication of a book on something that has happened in recent past, expressing a certain point of view. Now, my honest opinion here could be slightly different from the flow of opinion that I've seen so far, which is the publisher is the scapegoat here. Okay. The publisher has unfortunately become the topic of this particular discussion, when in fact the people who have the power to prevent such a powerful publisher from publishing a book are the ones who should be the subject of discussion.
But they gave in, Sai.
No. Let me be
action of cancelling the book, which has become the point.
Let me answer that question. So here's where the thing is. The reality of India's ecosystem model that has been there for 70 years is that some groups and some individuals are more powerful than certain institutions.
Yes.
Okay. What is happening in constitutional fora with respect to some groups having a problem with certain people and leveling these kind of allegations that we've been seeing is also the product of the same bent of mind, wherein as long as you dance to a certain tune and you toe a certain line, then everything is hunky-dory. then the institution will be celebrated as the guardian of free speech, as the watchdog of the constitution, as the enabler of free expression and whatnot. Okay. Conferences will be held, articles will be published, songs will be written, poems will be composed, everything will happen. Okay. But the moment you cross that particular threshold and you say, sorry, I have a mind of my own, allow me to exercise that mind. I'm an institution which is meant to be independent and autonomous. So let me do that, whether as a private institution or a public institution. Then they say, oh, meri billi, mujhe miyan. Now you see what I do. Okay. And then they start going after that particular institution. Never underestimate the power of a let's say, an organized influential clique or cabal. And Bloomsbury India or any particular publication or any particular organization, if you believe, is capable of withstanding all of this pressure, remember that after a point, every organization becomes hostage to a certain group, to a certain...
You're not hostage of a mentality too. You're painting them as victims, unfortunately.
No, see, every such institution, let's take this for instance.
You know, today, Sai, there are so many examples where people have withstood this onslaught as well.
Right.
Why people like you exist. That is why people like me exist. And we are nobodies. I mean, I am, at least I consider myself a nobody. You are a senior lawyer or would be senior lawyer. But my point,
I'm a nobody myself, but here's where you have to consider.
Question here had a very straight choice.
Right.
Today or to forever be free.
No.
To give in.
No. So I'm not trying to be sympathetic or empathetic to anybody's cause, but having seen what happens in certain places, I can tell you one thing for a fact. A choice may be simple if all of the stakes are completely done away with and all of the questions don't figure as part of the particular equation. Okay. But when you have existed as part of an ecosystem for several decades, then उस ecosystem पे आपकी बहुत सारी मेहरबानियां होती हैं.
Yeah, agreed, of course.
That is a fact. Okay. And therefore, no organization, no matter how big, can afford to take any decision independent of those stakes and independent of all those meherbaniyan. Okay. So today, some people are effectively saying, I have done so much. Now is the time for you to repay. And I want you to repay by canceling someone and by deplatforming someone. Okay. I am not giving a free pass to someone who's buckled. I'm merely saying that particular person who's buckled is the product of a certain action which has been initiated by someone else. So our entire discussion will be misplaced if we focus on the person who's buckled as opposed to those people who have the power to ensure that all these institutions and all these private and public institutions dance to their tunes. Those are the very people, and that is the mentality which must be gone after, because it has existed without a challenge for a very long time. Now that it is waking up and smelling the coffee, that there is a huge challenge to its way of life, to its ideology, to its nazariya, to whatever it may be, it has begun to effectively say, if I don't nip it at the bud and don't make an example out of a few people, this will then rise to become a huge movement. So I'm very happy this has happened.
So I understand where you're coming. I'll come to that. But I disagree on one thing, because I understand the criticism was of the pre-launch event and certain individuals on that pre-launch event.
Correct.
I can still understand that for some sort of to save your face or to maybe correct what you thought went wrong, or for whatever reason, it's your call. You decided to cancel that event.
Right.
My question is, how can you, on all honesty,
right,
take on a book,
right,
but then suddenly drop it like a hot potato, just
right,
objected to a launch event, not even the book.
Right.
When it comes from a publisher,
right,
what does it tell you about our actual freedom?
What it tells us is that free speech in this country is a joke. Okay. Free platform is a joke. Almost every point of view exists and thrives in an echo chamber. Okay. And when a new point of view tries to rear its head and make its presence felt and say, hear me out, don't be so insecure, judge me on my merits, judge me on my facts, we don't seem to have the stomach, spine, or the brains for it. That is the broad reality. That is a fact. Okay. No industry is an exception to this. Publication industry is perhaps in the news, and this is something that we're seeing for the very first time because they've managed to expand the scope of their access to other points of view as well. Remember, when this particular book must have been commissioned, a host of editorial controls would have been exercised. And
Yes.
given the topic of this particular book and the contents of this particular book, somebody would have applied their mind. They'd have gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. They'd have gone through it with a micro scanner and everything to see सब कुछ ठीक है या नहीं, वरना legal case हो जाएगा. इतना तो किसी ने देखा होगा, right? Now, after having done that, therefore a conscious call is taken, resources are committed, and the book is about to be published, and everything has happened. At that stage, if somebody has the power to pull the plug, okay, imagine the power of that ecosystem and imagine the influence of that particular ecosystem and imagine its investment in all these places. Okay, so yes, the publisher and that particular entity has made a mockery of itself, has made a mockery of its commitment to free speech and expression. There is no doubting it at all. Okay, however, we are all effectively held hostage to such forces, to such interests, and to such stakes. Therefore,
So tell me, how do we deal with that?
disruptive innovation.
Suggestions to deal with this so-called the big man that seeks to control how all of us behave and how, what we say, what we think, or what we are allowed to be, even though they talk about freedom and democracy and constitution.
So I'm paraphrasing an African thinker here who effectively said that if at the end of the day the prey has to tell its own story, it can't expect the predator to give it access and platform. Okay, the prey has to write its own story at the end of the day. Okay, so I believe that for the last 6 to 7 years, a churn has started at multiple levels in various industries, where the accepted norm and the accepted, let's say, point of view is under serious challenge, and people are saying enough is enough. This unnecessary hypocrisy has gone on for a long time. If you ultimately believe that you're the repository of free speech, expression, knowledge, and information, everything under the sun, let me present a few counterfacts. Let me present the counterpoint of view, and let the public decide whose point of view has more validity. Okay. The thing is, अगर public ने सुन लिया, तो उनको समझ में आएगा कि सच क्या है. Okay. And therefore, the cancel culture, the woke culture, the deplatforming culture, the gagging culture is on the rise. Okay. But bhaiya, you live in the age of internet, self-publication, Kindle hai, sab kuch hai. You are the dinosaur who's effectively trying to resort to these old forms of deplatforming and gagging. This is not the media of the 70s and 80s where you can kick a journalist out for having a different opinion, or you can kick someone out, or you can finish their culture, or let's say their careers, you can destroy their careers. Ye time ja chuka hai. Okay.
Unfortunately, that still happens. But of course, the fight
still happens. But here, I think technology has made it possible for certain individuals to survive despite these ecosystems. See.
No, but I feel, Sai, I disagree with you here.
Okay. Okay.
Make their choices here. Like you said, आप मेहरबानी लोगे तो कभी ना कभी तो चुकाना पड़ेगा.
जी जी बिल्कुल.
When that happens and when that strikes,
right,
you don't know.
Right.
You know. So individuals make a choice of not being under anybody's favors.
Agreed.
Their lives like that, and those are the only individuals who can roam free. Right. I do mention here though that the book that we're discussing right now, I hope I get the title right, Delhi Riots 2020,
right,
has been picked up by another publication called Garud Publication.
Garud Publication, correct. Yes.
To that, and kudos to that. But do you believe that the reverse that has happened also, that several people are canceling their books on this particular publisher's platform?
Right.
Also an appropriate response, at least in the short term, is that a good response?
See, the basic message at this stage is not to let the entity get away with a sense of kya ho jayega. Okay.
That there will be no consequences.
Yes, they need to know that there is a certain amount of harm and a certain amount of cost. Okay. At one stage, I think when a popular actor ended up making a particularly nasty comment about the state of India and the state of affairs in India, he, as well as entities associated with him or the entities for which he was a brand ambassador, they paid a price, severe price. And within a few days, he was working hard on a movie about Indian wrestlers. Okay. And he came out with movies where he effectively started singing praises and let's say songs in praise of India and whatnot. Okay. That therefore, economics has become a tool of ensuring that people realize that they can't take an anti-national position or they can't take an anti-India position after a certain point. Okay. So in the age of market forces, I believe that whatever these authors have done, regardless of what it ultimately translates to, I think is a very brave move, is a bold move. And I appreciate and admire the courage of the conviction to take this particular position. Let's be honest, I may or I may not agree with what they have done, because my point would be, Why would you want to let go of a certain space? Okay, you have a certain space that gives you a multiplier effect, that gives you a megaphone. However, despite having access to such space, if they've been able to take a principled position, I would certainly appreciate the particular position. And I hope this particular publisher or this entity and other entities understand that they can perhaps exercise their editorial controls, which they should have when they were actually reviewing a particular book for its contents. But to then give way to knee-jerk reactions at a later stage sends a very bad message. Yeah.
Since you are a lawyer, I have to ask you, are they not subject to a legal suit here?
I would say that the author has perhaps enough and more ammunition, going by what I've seen so far in social media. The legal notice that has been issued on behalf of the author, I've just read it. And I'm asking myself, why would they do this even at the pain of serious damages that could be awarded against the publishing entity for a clear violation, or at least on the face of it, there appears to be a violation of the contract. Okay. So see, that's why pardon me for saying this like a stuck gramophone. आपको पता है कि ये कैंसिल करने का मतलब है एक सूट को न्योता देना. Okay. Particularly when you know that the author herself is a lawyer, okay, and a lawyer of standing and repute in the Delhi High Court. Someone who has the guts to actually write on the Delhi riots against the popular narrative. You have decided to alienate that person at the pain of a suit as well. तो कितनी मेहरबानियां ली होंगी, कितना वापस आपको चुकाना पड़ रहा है, and how much of confidence others would have given to say कुछ भी हो जाए हम आपके पीछे हैं, हम आपको देख लेंगे, आप चिंता मत कीजिए. So what kind of confidence would have given them the comfort to take this particular decision? Clearly, this is nothing compared to what they have enjoyed all these years. Okay. And when somebody is effectively cashing in on the chips that they have invested in this particular casino, so to speak, this casino has to say, ठीक है भैया अभी कर देंगे और क्या करें, इतनी तो हमने खाया है और कुछ नहीं कर सकते. Okay.
But the house always wins.
The house always wins.
Yeah. It's a small price to pay.
Right. It's peanuts compared to what they are bound to get from others. And एक lit fest रख देंगे, इसको एक topic बना देंगे, ये सब कर देंगे, बात खत्म. Public में भी ये भी भूल जाएगी.
It's quite possible, though, I think, that maybe the publisher here perhaps went a little bit beyond their call of duty. They could have just cancelled the event that was in question.
Exactly.
Twice. Correct. But I think they've dug themselves into a hole now. And as you said, since it is happening in 2020 and not 1980, it is going to be remembered and quoted for a long time to come. Sai, I think we've dealt with a lot of issues for a good hour, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
I did.
I just want to mention for those who could not watch it, this will be up on Sai's YouTube channel as well. Yes. And you can always watch it at a later stage. I do appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed all the deep and probing questions. I had a lot of fun. Let's do this sometime again on a different topic.
Absolutely. Looking forward. Thank you so much.
Take care.